Hello and welcome to the ECPE Speaking Test seminar. My name is Nick Frangos. I am Academic Coordinator at the Hellenic American Union, and my email address is nfrangos@hau.gr. Let me just say a few general things about the Hellenic American Union, and more specifically about the Center for Examinations and Certifications. The Hellenic American Union has been a leader in designing and providing lifelong learning opportunities for hundreds of thousands of women and men for over 60 years. Its Center for Examinations and Certifications has administered open and fair language examinations since 1957. The administration of language examinations and examinations that lead to professional certifications is an important part of our orientation as a not-for-profit association and reflects our commitment to supporting our stakeholders' prospects for a successful academic and professional career and personal development. So, more specifically now, Michigan Language Assessment, which is a non-profit collaboration between the University of Michigan and Cambridge Assessment English, and whose mission is to help people achieve their education and career goals, and to provide trusted English language exams that draw on the expertise of two of the world's leading universities, the University of Michigan and Cambridge Assessment English, two institutions with long and distinguished histories in the field of language assessment, teaching, and research. Michigan Language Assessment has provided American English language assessments for more than 65 years. Our rich history began with the establishment of the English Language Institute, ELI, in 1941 as the first university-based intensive English program in the United States and the first language research and teaching program of its kind. The foundation of modern American English language testing began at ELI. Michigan exams tradition continues today with modern English language tests that are recognized by universities, education departments and ministries, businesses, and government agencies around the world. In 2010, the testing division of the University of Michigan English Language Institute joined with Cambridge Assessment English to form CAMLA, a non-profit collaboration for the continued production of high-quality English language tests. Now known as Michigan Language Assessment, we remain committed to delivering outstanding and reliable assessments and helping English language learners prove their skills to the world. Now let us focus more specifically on the ECPE Speaking Test. Let's just see the C2 requirements of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. And more specifically, so someone at this level can understand with ease virtually everything heard or read, can summarize information from different spoken and written sources, reconstructing arguments and accounts in a coherent presentation, and can express him or herself spontaneously, very fluently and precisely, differentiating finer shades of meaning even in more complex situations. The ECPE Speaking Test description. Well, first of all, it is a decision-making task. There are two test takers, and sometimes there might be a group of three, and there are always two examiners. The test lasts between 25 and 35 minutes. There are 5 stages, and examiner 1 conducts stages 1 through 3, and examiner 2 conducts stages 4 and 5. Now, the stages of the speaking test. Stage 1 is the introduction. Stage 2 is about explaining and recommending. Stage 3, about consensus reaching. Stage 4 is presenting and convincing. And stage 5 is justifying and defending. And of course, we will see each of these stages in greater detail in the following slides. In order to be successful in this test, the language functions that are required are: the student must be able to ask and answer questions, explain points, provide suggestions, recommendations, present a decision, justify a decision, compare and contrast, discuss and develop a topic, elaborate on certain points, sustain talk, initiate and take turns. Let us begin, of course, with stage 1, which is the introduction. So in the introduction, test takers are asked questions about themselves. Test takers speak naturally. Test takers participate actively and can use body language. And test takers should avoid pre-rehearsed speech. It is very important that test takers do not answer by using dry answers, in other words, simply a yes or a no, or maybe the name of a location. Should always try to say more and should try not to get stuck. This is very, very important, especially at this level. That means that if they cannot think of a word, students should be able to paraphrase, explain, use alternative words so that the examiner can understand, and believe me, the examiners will understand. So not getting stuck is important, and I would also like to mention that at the very end of the introduction, there will be a lead-in question, and this lead-in question will give the test takers an idea as to what will follow, what, in other words, the rest of the test will be about, what will be discussed in the rest of the test. As we said earlier, stage 2 has to do with explaining and recommending. And more specifically, the examiner will provide the context of the role play. The test takers are given the speaking prompts. Test takers aren't allowed to look at each other's information sheet, and test takers get 2 minutes to familiarize themselves with the prompts. Now, some very important points here. Once the test takers have their information sheets, they should look at the title, and this will give them a very good idea as to what the task is, what the decision-making task is. And also, during the 2 minutes during which the students are preparing, the students can ask questions. So once the test takers have been given their information sheets and the 2 minutes are up, the first student can begin by making a brief introduction based on the title that he or she sees on the information sheet. Then the test taker can continue by mentioning the name of each option. The test taker should discuss all points that he or she sees on the information sheets and can enrich these points by adding logical assumptions. Logical assumptions being generally accepted truths, but these should be short. They should not be very, very long. Comments that are generally accepted as being valid. The first test taker will explain the 2 options that he or she has on his or her information sheet. Then the second test taker will recommend one of the options that he or she just heard, then the second test taker will explain his or her two options to test taker 1, of course, and then test taker 1 will recommend one of the options that he or she just heard from test taker 2. The test takers keep notes, especially when their partners are presenting their options. Once both test takers have finished explaining and recommending, they will be asked to choose one of their own options without explaining why. I stress this, it is not necessary for the test takers to explain why they have selected one of their two options. So please take a couple of minutes to look at the slide that has one indicative information sheet. Here the decision-making task, as you can see, is choosing a program for a secondary school. And what the test takers will be told is, and they will not see this written, but they will be told this by the examiner, that you are members of a school board and your school needs to choose a program to fund. 4 programs have made it to the final selection process. You will each need to explain the 2 programs that you have been provided with so that you both know about the 4 programs. So once the students begin their presentations, they should try as much as possible, as I said, to use accurate synonyms. They should try to change parts of the speech. They can use active, passive voice. So if the bullet point, if the point is an active voice, can be changed to passive voice or the other way around. Can explain words or ideas using their own words, can organize, connect the bullet points, but they don't have to do this necessarily, depending if the bullet points are related, can use appropriate linking phrases, can introduce points without linking words, can use a point to justify another point, and of course, it is important that when presenting the various options, the test taker needs to mention the name of each option that he or she presents. And of course, as I said earlier, to add a logical assumption that is also useful. In other words, to explain something about the feature, but this should be done very briefly. So let us have a look at an example by which synonyms are used. These test takers should consider the context and use accurate synonyms. Now, indicatively, we have the point costs $12,500. What the test taker can say is the school will have to spend $12,500, which is quite reasonable. Or the price of instruments, I'm saying, will come up to $12,500. Or the option instruments is worth $12,500. Or the expenditure for instruments will be $12,500. I take this opportunity to remind teachers and of course test takers to be prepared and to have refreshed their knowledge of numbers, not to get confused, because sometimes that can happen. Another example of changes that could be made, as we said, active to passive or passive to active voice. Let's have a look at the point on the information sheet. Parents request more computer classes. This can be changed to more computer classes are requested by parents. And we know they want the best for their children. That is a short, logical assumption. let's have a look at the point additional band instructor needed. This can be changed to we will need to employ or hire or get an extra instructor for the band. Some more examples. Let's have a look at the point 35% of students benefit. This can be changed to it will be beneficial to 35% of the students. Another point, construction noise will disrupt classes. This can be changed to the noise from the construction will cause disruption for classes. Additionally, roundabout expressions can be used. So let's have a look at the point student musicians earn better grades. This could be changed to people who study music have a better academic performance, or music students receive better marks, or students who learn how to play music do better at school. Now let's have a look at an example in which we will combine 2 points. So let's have a look at the 2 points, costs $11,000 and 70 pieces of athletic equipment. So this could be presented as we will have to spend $11,000 in order to purchase 70 pieces of athletic equipment. Or the total amount for purchasing 70 pieces of athletic equipment will come up to $11,000. Or, if our school funds the athletic equipment program, we will have to invest $11,000. As I mentioned earlier, this is not necessary. In other words, students do not have to do this for all the points. If a student, a test taker, feels that he or she can do it, especially when points are similar, then that is fine, as we saw here in the example. Now let's have a look at some linking words and phrases that can be used in this stage as well. So let's have a look at the bullet points. 3 more teams formed and students interested in team sports. So have a look at the students are very keen on team sports. Therefore, we will form additional teams in our school. So these 2 were combined using a linking word. Similarly, the students are very keen on team sports. Moreover, we will form additional teams in our school. As I mentioned earlier, it is important that all points are presented in this stage. These points can be introduced using one of the expressions that you see here or any other appropriate expression. A great point concerning X is such and such, X being the name of the option. Or what looks like a great asset about X, as I said, the name of the option, is that. Or another point worth mentioning about X is. Or another important feature of X is. Or the information about X further states that. Or any other way that you feel appropriate in order to introduce the points that appear in the options. So let's have a look at a point mentioned in an option, indicatively completed in 3 months. This can be explained. The computer lab will be completed in 3 months. I believe it's a good thing that it won't take that long for our students to start using it. Another point in the option, student must pay to use. Actually, this is the disadvantage, and please keep in mind, I take this opportunity to mention that there are 6 points that are positive and 1 point that is the last point, and that is the disadvantage. And it is important to stress that this is indeed the disadvantage. Indicatively here, a disadvantage of this option is that students must pay to use these instruments. But that might help them appreciate the instruments more and keep them in a good condition. As I said, the explaining, though, needs to be brief, does not need to be very extensive, but relevant, of course. As I mentioned earlier, once the first test taker has finished presenting his or her two options, then the other test taker must make a recommendation, indicatively. Having heard about your two options, I think you should choose such and such. And as I said, no explanation is required. Or, if I were you, I would choose such and such option. Or, I believe such and such option is much better than the other option that the second test taker heard. I stress that it is not necessary for the second student to explain why he or she selected the option or recommended the option that he or she just stated. And of course, as I said earlier, once this part has finished, then the examiner will ask each test taker which option they prefer from their two options. And they do not need to give an explanation. So once each test taker has selected one of their options, this will bring us into stage 3, which is the consensus reaching stage. And the two options that were selected, one by test taker 1 and one by test taker 2, from their options, I remind you, these will be used for the consensus reaching. More specifically, what needs to take place here? First of all, it is not necessarily a debate. What needs to be done is the options that were selected need to be compared and contrasted. The test takers need to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the options. It is important that the test takers always give feedback. For example, I see your point, but in other words, to always acknowledge that the test takers heard what their partner has said. Now, in this stage, as opposed to stage 2, where, as I mentioned, all points need to be discussed, here in this stage, most points need to be discussed. In other words, what needs to take place is a discussion, as we said, comparing, contrasting, that will last about 5 minutes. So this usually means that maybe 4 or 5 points can be discussed, can be compared, and of course the negative point as well. The test takers always need to remember who they are and why they are taking the decision. And as I said, they need to discuss for about 5 minutes. This is very, very important. And I stress this because it is not good for the students to reach a consensus too quickly. If they do, it's not the end of the world. The examiner will simply say, you have a few more minutes to discuss. On the other hand, it's not good for the students to go on and on. Once again, the examiner will give the students a hint that they need to be reaching a consensus. Please take a minute to look at the options that were selected by the two test takers at the end of stage 2. So one test taker selected empty pockets and the other test taker selected Lady Fortune. Empty pockets was one of the two options that test taker 1 had, and Lady Fortune was one of the two options that test taker 2 had. And now they need, as I said, to compare and contrast these two options. Okay, what would assist in their discussion, in the test taker's discussion, they could see, for example, what points are common. For example, here on the slide you can see that both options play popular music, are currently performing somewhere, and are recognized, are known. What is different, we could see, Empty Pockets is a band and is experienced, whereas Lady Fortune is a solo artist and she is young, meaning that maybe she is not so experienced. These points can be discussed. This is how these options can be compared. Compare, as we said, and contrast. An indicative discussion could be, here you see on the slide, test taker 1 introduces the point and compares points. For example, I see that both our candidates play popular kinds of music. This is a very important point, as we can be sure that the CD is likely to have a great appeal to the market. Now, as I said, always the test takers need to give feedback. So, test taker 2 now speaking, you're right. Both R&B and jazz have many fans around the world. So I guess Empty Pockets and Lady Fortune are more or less the same. So test taker 2 has given feedback to the point that test taker 1 introduced, and now test taker 2 needs to introduce a new point indicatively. And what about the fact that they are both away giving performances at the moment? It's great that they are both popular and appear live in front of their audience. Now, feedback, of course, test taker 1 speaking. Excellent point. We want them to appear on stage. It increases their popularity. And of course, this would continue by test taker 1 introducing another point. So, some tips for this stage, for coming to an agreement. The students need to play the role, need to interact, not just present features again. It's not about repeating what was discussed in stage 2 and what was presented. They need to give reasons and how they feel about the various points, give feedback, refer to the situation, as we said, compare and contrast, discuss advantages and disadvantages, and of course at the end, after about 5 minutes, as I said, it should be at least 5 minutes, choose the best option and of course explain the reasons for their selection. So the test takers need to explain the reasons for the option they chose. So we have now reached stage 4. Just to go over what we did, we started off in stage 2 with 4 options, 2 options each test taker. At the end of stage 2, each test taker selected 1 option, so that is 2 options, and these 2 options were used to reach a consensus in stage 3. So from the 2, 1 was selected, and now in stage 4, this 1 option will be presented to the second examiner, who, as we said, plays the role of somebody who has some sort of authority. More specifically, stage 4 has 2 parts. The first part is planning and preparing the presentation. And of course, the second part is the actual formal presentation. Now, for the part that has to do with planning and preparing the presentation, the test takers will get 2 minutes to prepare. And more specifically, what the test takers need to do is to decide which 2 points each will be included in their presentation. They also need to discuss what the examiner might ask based on what is presented. They need to have a look at the negative point, briefly think about it, but the negative point is never presented in this stage. The test takers should also not forget the role that was given to them. They should also decide during this preparation stage who will begin, and they need to switch into formal register once they begin their presentation. And of course, for each point they present to the second examiner, they need to justify why these points are important, and they need to be convincing. I would just like to say that during this stage, no Greek should be used. And as I said, the test takers should quickly decide which points they will each present. To think about the justification, have a quick look at the negative point, and of course, as we said, who will go first. Once the 2 minutes are up, the first examiner will introduce the second examiner to the test takers, and then, of course, the test takers will begin their presentation. And more specifically, the first test taker will begin by saying something indicatively. You can see what is on the slide. After careful consideration, we have come to the conclusion that such and such option would be the best choice for whatever the topic is about. Then the test taker that has gone first needs to present 2 points. The first reason, indicatively, why we believe such and such option would be the best is because, and a point is mentioned, and also a justification for that point. And then a second point is mentioned by the first test taker, and of course, this also needs to be justified. Once this has been done by the first test taker, then the first test taker will give the floor to his or her partner. And this will be done by saying something like, and now my partner will continue with 2 more points in favor of such and such option. So the second test taker will now present 2 points, as we said, a point and justification, and then another point, and that also needs to be justified. Once the second test taker has presented 2 more points, then the second test taker will wrap everything up by saying, this is why we both believe that such and such option would be the best option or the best choice for whatever the task is, as one can see on the title of the information sheets. So once the presentation has finished, during which each test taker will have presented 2 points each and will have justified each of these points, the examiner will continue by asking at least 1 challenge question to each test taker based on the points that were presented in the previous stage. During this stage, the test takers, of course, need to defend their options based on what the examiner has asked them. The test takers need to focus on the particular point and not bring in information from other features of the option. However, when answering the challenge questions, the test takers can bring in information. In other words, as you can see on the slide, ideas and creativity are not assessed. However, they need to address the concern that the examiner has stated in the challenge question and reassure the examiner that there is no reason to worry. Of course, what is also assessed in this stage is the overall quality of language used. Now let us have a look at an example of a challenge question. Examiner will ask the test taker who, in his or her presentation, mentioned that empty pockets have been in the music scene for 20 years, this specific question. You said empty pockets have been in the music scene for 20 years. I'm worried that people will not buy the CD of an old band, but they might prefer someone new and fresh. I am concerned whether they will appeal to today's market. Now let us have a look at two indicative answers. Now the test taker is speaking. You have a point, but I don't think that they will have a problem. I think it's very important that they have been together for so long. It shows that they work well together, and this is something that we want. Now, if you could just think a little bit about this answer is really not an appropriate answer for the challenge question that was asked by the examiner. The examiner asked whether they will appeal to today's market. So this answer would not really meet the standard. Let's have a look at another indicative answer. Once again, the test taker speaking. I understand your concern, but this is nothing to worry about. Taking examples from the music industry, like Aerosmith or the Rolling Stones, we see that fans are loyal to their favorite bands no matter how long they've been around. Contrary to your concern, I think it's a very positive point that this band has kept its fans for so many years. I am convinced that it will still appeal to the market today. Now, as you can see, this was an appropriate answer, and of course, this definitely meets the standard. Let us now have a look at some of the criteria that are used to assess the ECPE Speaking Test. Let's have a look to our left at a couple of the points. So, occasionally able when prompted to elaborate and provide explanations on most concrete topics. Explanations frequently lack coherence and organization. Usually presents decisions by repeating language already produced. Now let's move a little bit to the center. Frequent use of basic structures that often contain errors. Or limited range of vocabulary. Or frequently uses vague and or inaccurate vocabulary. Now, as you can understand, these criteria apply to a speaker, to a test taker, who is below the standard. Let us have a look at some of the criteria that apply to a test taker that meets the standard. Once again, let's have a look to our left. So, adequately explains, may rely on written material periodically, elaborates, often without prompting, and provides coherent explanations on almost all concrete and many abstract topics. and let's move a little bit to the center, often uses a variety of basic and complex grammatical structures accurately and effectively. Often uses a variety of grammatical structures that are pragmatically appropriate. Often uses a moderate range of vocabulary accurately and appropriately. So, as I mentioned, these criteria apply to a test taker that meets the level of the test. Now, as teachers, in order to prepare your students for this speaking test, you need to make sure that your students can use their own words as much as possible, especially in a stage 2. Present information naturally, not mechanically. Explain when describing using logical assumptions, and this applies in stage 2 as well. Justify their opinion. They need to be able to compare and contrast, and this applies mostly for stage 3. Elaborate on particular aspects. Defend their option and be convincing. Your students also need to use a good range of vocabulary, use appropriate words that fit the context. Your students should be able to switch between informal and formal register. Your students should use different grammatical structures accurately and not just simple grammatical structures. Should be able to link their ideas naturally and logically, and speak fluently without hesitations and pauses. This does not, of course, mean that they should be overly anxious about hesitating or pausing, because this is natural. We all pause or hesitate when we talk. However, hesitations should not be such that would give the impression that the test taker is searching for words. I hope you have found this information and this presentation useful. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions. You could also visit our site at www.hau.gr and also visit our Facebook page. And you can like us on Facebook if you, of course, like what you see. Once again, I would like to thank you very much and wish your students good luck. Thank you.